Welcome everyone. Great to see you all here. Welcome to this year's new round of CPRN online workshops. I'm very glad that we get to start with a exciting topic. I'm really glad that we have Aleksandra Piletić here to talk about renewable energy and EU-led authoritarian neoliberalization. Because usually renewable energy policy tends to be the sort of thing where we on the left tend to agree that decisive policy is necessary, but at the same time, there are implications about potential authoritarianization in its implementation that we perhaps don't think about enough. And in that sense, I'm really, really curious to hear more about this topic and to discuss it with all of you. And obviously, we also have great discussants, Alke, Jenss, Yuliya, Yurchenko. So yeah, looking forward to the workshop. Maybe just a bit of housekeeping. As you can see, the thing is being recorded. So yeah, just keep that in mind. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to get a roughly 15-minute input from Alex, followed by the two commentaries by Alke and Yuliya, followed by then Q&A afterwards. So yeah, please keep yourself muted until you want to ask questions. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Alex.
First of all, hello everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, CPRN is always such a fun thing to be a part of, and it's really good to see so many familiar faces. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to talk about this, and also to my fabulous discussants. Thank you so much for taking the time for this. This is a paper. This is a paper that was published in Globalization as part of a special issue that was edited by, among others, Alke, who was one of the discussants today. It's a fabulous special issue, and I'm really, really excited I got to be a part of it. So this is a paper that. Let me move on to the next slide. That tries to make sense of this boom that is happening in the Balkans of small hydropower plants, small hydropower plant developments, which are really proliferating at an unprecedented rate throughout the entire region. Particularly, I focus on Serbia, and I try to understand what is happening with small hydropower plants. They are really truly becoming core to many states' renewable energy efforts. So I think it is important to focus on them in particular as kind of central to renewable energy in the Balkans at the moment. So before moving into the argument that I make, let me just quickly sort of outline what small hydropower is and why it makes sense in the Balkans. So small hydropower is small hydropower plants are small investments. They are small power plants that, unlike large hydropower plants and dams that are relatively easy to construct, relatively easy, and do not require large state-led investments. They can be constructed in a relatively short period of time. Actually, the longest part of the construction process, especially in Serbia, is getting the necessary permits and doing the necessary assessments for before the construction starts. So these are small investments made by usually individuals, and they have kind of become very popular in the Balkans because of the fact that the terrain, the physical terrain of the region is such that it is conducive to small hydropower plant construction. Small hydropower plants they function by diverting a part, but usually the entire river, into a canal, into a pipe that is located on a hill normally, and the elevation drop is what is used normally to generate to produce energy. So it's conducive to mountainous, hilly areas, usually remote areas, relatively remote areas. And there are many such areas in Serbia, in the Balkans in general. And these are, because they are such small units, they never produce more than 10 megawatts of energy. Frequently, they produce much, much less than this. Not just in Serbia, but throughout the world where they have been constructed, they have been associated with a wide variety of adverse impacts. They make a negligible contribution to a country's energy production capacity, but actually are associated with massive environmental destruction, and also have a negative social impact on the local communities that depend on the rivers where these small hydropower plants are constructed. So as you can imagine, diverting a part of a river into a pipe, or in many cases the entire river, usually impacts the flow of the fish in the river, as well as the other aquatic organisms that are that live in the river. It negatively impacts the biodiversity of the area. It impacts the ability of the local community to use the river for their own purposes, for agricultural and personal purposes, to fish in the river, etc. So it is, there are many reasons why small hydropower plants are kind of contested all over the world. In the context of Serbia, what is important is that the move to kind of this boom in small hydropower plant construction is very closely linked to Serbia's EU accession. So, and particularly its membership in the energy community. So the energy community is an organization which allows that has as its aim the extension of the EU energy markets past the EU and into the region of Southeast Europe and the Black Sea region. So obviously this is an EU organization that serves to advance the interests of the EU, and the states and Serbia's role, or kind of its accession process, has kind of pushed it into membership of the energy community. So it is for this reason in Serbia's interest as well. But at the same time, what membership in the energy community has kind of the impact of Serbia's membership in the energy community is that it is bound to meet certain national targets, which are imposed as part of the energy community membership. In particular, for instance, the 2009 EU Renewable Energy Directive imposes binding national targets for renewables, which have led Serbia to, as part of its 2014 energy law, internalize this these national targets, and to kind of set out incentives and subsidies which it believes would allow it to meet these binding national targets. And this is clearly stated in this Serbian energy law. This kind of this reflection of the fact that this is a part of its membership in the energy community. The key point here is that the energy law establishes a new category of so-called privileged power producers, and these are essentially producers who are paid at a favorable rate, more favorable than the market rate, to produce energy, and so these are renewable energy producers, not just small hydropower plants, but this applies to wind and solar as well, but small hydropower has emerged as kind of the most lucrative. And also the state-owned electricity supplier is obligated, so it's committed and locked in to purchase all energy produced by these producers, I think for a period of 12 or 15 years. I'm not exactly sure. This entire process is financed or kind of supported through generous loans that investors are able to obtain through the EBRD and the EIB, or at least through regional partners of these two European banks. So all in all, as you can see, this entire process is very, very deeply entangled with the EU accession process. At the same time, small hydropower plants have been heavily contested in Serbia. They have been perceived as illegal, criminal, and not just because the investors are, frequently have ties to criminal ties, but also because very often what happens is regulations and laws are circumvented or explicitly broken in order for the small hydropower plant to be constructed. In other words, it is very clear that the rules are not followed. So what ends up happening is that the small hydropower plants are shoddily constructed. They have a devastating impact on the environment. It's clear that there is a loss in biodiversity, and that the local community is significantly impacted. And contestation efforts in response to this kind of perception of the illegality and criminality of these projects is met with violent retaliation by both police forces, official police, and private security forces, which are very frequently hired to police to secure the surrounding area of the small hydropower plant. So I won't go into too much detail. If we can maybe do this in the discussion. How much time do I have still?
About 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, great, perfect. I won't go into too much detail about this, but in the paper I focus on one particular small hydropower plant, which is located in, I don't know if you can see it on here, the southeastern Bulgarian border region in Serbia called Rakita. It's a small hydropower plant called Zvonce. I focus on this small hydropower plant in particular because it has kind of broader relevance, a broader it has become a symbol of the nationwide struggle against small hydropower plants in Serbia. It was financed by a loan from UniCredit Bank, a regional EBRD partner, and it, like in many cases, it was clear that a number of regulations and procedures were circumvented in this case. For instance, the construction permit was kind of faulty. It wasn't really clear if it was illegalized, or sorry, it was kind of the expression that it was not a legal construction permit, it was falsified. Also, the environmental impact assessment that is a necessary part of the process before the construction of the small hydropower plant, that was never conducted. And the local communities in Rakita were not also consulted. So it was clear that this investor, Goran Belic, he did not actually, that he kind of had either deep connections in the state, it was not a regular procedure. So it was a very contested project from the very beginning, and there were many efforts to scale up contestation, to form links with activists who were also engaged in similar struggles throughout the country. Some of these efforts were successful, others were not. In any case, this particular small hydropower plant did gain kind of broader significance and became well known even in Belgrade, in the capital. What ended up happening is that ultimately the Ministry of Environmental Protection, having done a kind of assessment of the impact of the small hydropower plant on the local environment, confirmed that massive environmental damage was done, occurred as a result of the construction of the plant, and that the construction should be halted. This decision was issued, however, construction did not stop. There was no sense that this order was actually going to be implemented, that it was going to be executed. So what you see in the bottom picture is a direct action where activists from all over, from both the surrounding area of Serbia, or of Rakita, and throughout Serbia from the capital city, they traveled to Rakita to actually physically try to remove and liberate the river from the pipe. And they obviously didn't succeed in doing so, because this is a 2-ton construction, and it's very difficult to actually break such a massive structure, but the pipe was damaged. The latest news is that the pipe was repaired, unfortunately, so it continued operation last year. This is the last information that I have. Okay, so how do I make sense of all of this? I think that the authoritarian neoliberalism literature is very, very useful for making sense of this, in particular the multi-scalar iterations of the concept. So here I'm referring to Ian Bruff's work, Woodcock Tansel's work, but also the work of Alke and myself. I have a paper that came out before this one on a large mega project in Belgrade that also kind of theorizes authoritarian neoliberalism in a multi-scalar way. So what do I mean by this? Is that, the idea is that following the 2008 financial crisis, the kind of the hegemonic aura of neoliberalism was lost, and there was an increasing need to resort to coercive measures, even though coercion was always part and parcel of neoliberalism in the first place, but a more systemic kind of sense that coercion is necessary for neoliberalism to proceed, to proceed in the first place. So this, and also the multi-scalar moment that, we should not be kind of these isolated instances of revolt and contestation against small hydropower plants really need to be contextualized within, a broader multi-scalar process of EU accession, kind of authoritarian hardening of the state at the national level, as well as a weakening of the state at the local level. Okay, I'm going to finish now, and then maybe we can move into the discussion. So just to conclude quickly, the renewable energy transition, rather than, like Ben said at the beginning, we do all agree that this is a good thing, but it is, it is important to get into the specificities and kind of how it can also become part and parcel of these, authoritarian moments as well, and that it is also, a contested process, that it is heavily contested and has implications locally. I do think authoritarian neoliberalism is a useful lens, and it allows us to also transcend this dichotomy of legality, illegality, kind of democracy, liberalism, etc. So all in all, I do think authoritarian power is not monolithic. There are possibilities for resistance. The real question is when, how, something that I'm still struggling to figure out. But Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Alex. I think we're all trying to figure that out in one way or another. So yeah, fascinating paper. I recommend that everyone read it, and yeah, really looking forward to the discussion. But yeah, first of all, let's go to our two discussants, and I think yeah, we can start with Alke.
All right. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thank you, Alex, for presenting the paper. And you said it already, it's part of a special issue that some of my colleagues and mine coordinated. So you're not going to hear much more than praise from me, obviously. But I'm glad I get to comment on this. So in the special issue, what we wanted to do was look at authoritarian practices and sort of their spatial and temporal articulations also beyond the state. And we draw from work on infrastructure studies and from work on global processes of capital accumulation and on nature-society relations. And your paper fits, I think, perfectly into that because it does several of these. And it sort of, to me, it shows really well the interconnectedness of different actors in effect, authoritarian practices, right? And forms of, well, making contestation more difficult. And I think it's really interesting how you show that it's this imposition that you sort of have to implement practically the entire legal body of the EU as a precondition to accession. And that creates, a terrain where it's much more difficult to contest sort of the legal regulations around this. But then through that, it creates incentives for private investors for this small hydro, and that makes it, and then you get these conflicts around small hydropower. And I think the one thing that you show there, that this is at the same time not a smooth rollout or seamless implementation, but it's also contested, right? Even if it's made more complicated, if coercion is used and so on, so I think what you bring in, and that's really well done, is the EU as an active agent in this, not just an institution that looks away, sort of, or that creates incentives for certain things, but then looks away at the coercive modes of implementation, but it's actually, it plays a constitutive role, as you say. So I think that's really well done. But one thing that I really love about the paper as well is that connection with illegality. I think it's really, it might seem like a side thing, but given that I've also used that reference to this economic geography paper on habitual practices of illegality that you referenced, Braxton and Crane, I think it is, from 2017. And I think you show really well how this is not an obstacle to EU investment, that there's different actors that link legal and illegal practices in capitalism, and how there's a link from these also to authoritarian practices. And I would push you even a bit more on that. And could you explain to us a little bit more how these are linked, how there's not an opposition between the rollout of small hydro and illegal practices, where you think that not only is small hydro seemingly more ecological than large-scale hydropower, but, no one would at the first sight think that there's illegal practices involved, right? So maybe that's one thing that I would ask you. And then I was wondering, because you talk about in the paper, you explain really well, I think, how the regulations actually work and how there's feed-in tariffs that then function basically as subsidies, and there's guaranteed rates for the investors for providing that energy, and it's a state-owned utility firm, right, that is then obliged to purchase this energy at these prices. Can you explain to us a little bit more the relation between this state utility firm and the investors, the Serbian private investors? Because maybe this is a bit nerdy, but this kind of thing has come up in my current work on large-scale hydro in Costa Rica and the transnational connections and so on, because there's a state-owned utility firm still in place in that context. So I would be really interested in how that relation plays out. And then maybe one more thing that I have to mention that I really like is, and you mentioned that you stressed that now in the end as well, is this the focus on scalar relations and the upscaling of that protest. And I think it's a really, really interesting case of where people from villages have, in the end, they succeed in really bringing their protest or bringing their interests to a wider audience and including people from other places that then join in their protests. And I mean, it's a clear case of at least to some extent, even though you said now that the plant in the Swansea plant is now repaired, but it's a case of success of upscaling, I would say. And particularly, I felt when I was reading the paper again that you make that clear when you say that the protesters also targeted banks in Belgrade, right? So it's not just targeting the plant itself, but people are actually aware of the connections of these different actors and the investors and so on. They were calling on the banks to refrain from financing such projects. So I think that's a really nice way of pulling in the different actors that are actually at play. Thank you. I'll stop here. I could ramble on about the paper, but I'm looking forward more to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alke. Very intriguing comments. Yuliya, floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to comment and for this fascinating paper. I really enjoyed reading it, so thank you a lot. I'm going to try to be brief because Alke covered quite a lot already, and she's much more intimately familiar with also how this paper sits next to the others. So. First of all, I just briefly, I think that it does the conceptual and theoretical framing of the paper is quite good, and I like how you enter into your argument by talking about the adoption of acquis and the very nature of the process is something that's rather imposing and monolithic in a sense that it's not really negotiable, and it's like it makes us consider sort of how not like in the abstract, but also in a very basic practical level, like, how democratic all these processes are, and also how much space for maneuver and democratic engagement and dialogue exists between the kind of the new potential and actual members of the EU and these institutions and regulations that have grown into something very far-reaching over the years. Some of the things that sit, so like, as I look at this, because I teach and research on environmental and ecological economics, and kind of an economics thought as well. And some of the things that strike me as always as a bit problematic, to put it mildly, and contradictory in some of these approaches in the EU is that there is an issue of there is a lot of these reforms that are being asked of smaller countries and actors. They're being done in the name of efficiency, smart use of resources, smart use of financing, sustainability, of course, so like carbon impact reduction and the rest of it. And when you look at actually what is being done, you see that some of these changes that are being implemented in this kind of small-scale hydro as part of the energy mix for sustainable low-carbon future doesn't quite survive the sustainability tests, as you already have demonstrated in your work to an extent. Of course, like, there is only so many aspects you can touch on in one paper. But I want to kind of push you to because you are clearly very familiar with this case, to tell us a bit more, because I'm quite curious. So First of all, like, you mentioned that small-scale hydro is only 11% of hydro production globally. And hydro production globally, I just looked up the most recent numbers for 2022, 23, hydropower was responsible for 14.96% of all energy consumption in the world. That's electricity specifically, but it generates electricity, so it makes sense. So roughly speaking, 11% of that is between 1.5 and 1.6. So yeah, it is kind of quite insignificant. At the same time, for an economy and for domestic electricity consumption size and kind of an industrial needs of Serbia, it may not necessarily be completely insignificant. Right. So I'm curious as to kind of how much was planned to achieve with this? Like, was it really a significant reduction? Because a lot of what looks on paper is not quite necessarily as good as all that. Small scale hydro, in the long run, especially in the climate zone where this case that we're looking at is not necessarily going to be very sustainable either, because water tables are dropping. There is increasing cases of drought, and therefore the potential longevity and life, longevity of these projects is heavily compromised. So I'm curious if that kind of climate change impact assessment was actually involved to any extent. I'm not sure if you looked into this, but if you had, I'm quite curious whether it has been involved when long-term sustainability, including financial sustainability and kind of prudency of use of resources for deployment of this kind of capacity was assessed. Because to me, with my kind of with a general understanding of what's happening in the Balkans with water access, especially in the summer months, we see that it's going to be quite compromised. I cannot imagine that they generate a lot of energy in the summer, especially. But overall, water tables are dropping in that region. So I'm not sure whether it's a smart use of resources, whether that is the kind of very good capacity to prioritize instead of wind and solar. So kind of where does this small scale hydro sit in the future energy mix? I'm curious. Why is it being prioritized to this extent? Because like I wouldn't choose it. And this leads me to the question of this corruption and customary criminality, and criminality is being something that's constitutive part of doing business. I'm quite interested in this conversation, and I also, just like Alke, want to sort of invite you to comment on this a little bit more. I read quite a bit on Central Eastern Europe, and as you know, I do quite a bit of research on Ukraine. And this stick of corruption is very often being used to further facilitate external oversight over certain processes in the country and engagement in certain processes by EU bureaucrats, amongst other things. But what I wanted to, and I think perhaps there is a whole separate paper in this. I would like to hear more about this customary criminality and illegality that accompanies doing business, and especially these kind of water resources and fight over access to different water resources for different purposes. That it's not something that only exists in some kind of less bureaucratized countries with less transparent processes and some almost natural cultural proclivity to engage in some bribery and nepotism and whatnot. This is something that accompanied development of capitalism from the beginning. And it hasn't stopped yet. Like, some of it looks a little bit more sophisticated. Some of it looks like an envelope on the table. Some of it looks like administrative pressure, racketeering, But fundamentally, it's not something that is foreign to doing business, to capitalist accumulation altogether. So I would like to push you a little bit. I'd like to ask you to tell us a bit more about this. And one final thing, I promise, it's to this. I already talked about this. I've made a bunch of comments in the video. Sorry. Oh yeah, so I wanted you to. So this is also kind of connects to what I was just saying. Is like discuss these forms of shall we say unmeritocratic ways or of doing business. Does that only relate to what is happening concretely locally with local actors, or do you identify foreign actors as well, who are trying to either get their pockets filled while having special access to these financing schemes as investors, as shareholders, anything of the kind? Like, what are kind of external actors and pressures could you tell us about? So yeah, I think I'll stop there because there is loads that we can talk about, but I'm sure more questions will pop up as you start responding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such great questions. So let me first start with the kind of the common question, the question or the customary illegality that you both touched upon, which I think it's a good starting point. Yeah, I think I definitely could have developed this more in the paper, and it is definitely a paper in its own right. How I see it is that the kind of the illegality of small hydropower plants, or the illegality is built into the way this plays out, because of the fact that, if we were to follow all of the necessary procedures, if we were to do an environmental impact assessment, if we were to respect the protected natural areas where small hydropower plants are not supposed to be built according to the law, and where they are increasingly built, if we were to do checks on who is investing, where the money's coming from, these would not be built. So in a sense, this is a structurally, kind of very, very clearly criminal, illegal project, or kind of set of projects that cannot be divorced from their illegality. The illegality is built into them. Yeah, so that would be my answer to that. I think so. So let me then go back to the question, because I think I have some statistics or numbers about this, which I think are very interesting. Yuliya's question about, where does this fit into kind of like, how sustainable is this really, and where does how does small hydropower kind of fit into our aim, to move towards renewable energy in the future? I hope it doesn't, because it is really so unproductive, and it is so destructive environmentally that it doesn't really make sense for these to even be built. So there are currently 122 small hydropower plants built in operation in Serbia. They produce 77 megawatts of energy. That's nothing. That is, so that, just to kind of compare, 7 wind farms, or at least, okay, the largest wind farm in Serbia, it's called Chibuk, and it has 57 wind turbines. They produce 158 megawatts of energy. So twice as much as all of the small hydropower plants operating in the country. So there is no benefits to these technologies. There is no, even at scale, we are getting very, very little energy from them. And if you look at the environmental, the biophysical degradation happening, it doesn't really make sense. So I hope this is not a part of Serbia's or any other country's sort of renewable energy strategies. And so and also, to connect to kind of a point that I think both of you made, that, you know, this is very much, it's not kind of marginal to the, you know, to the EU and its interests in the region. You know, the EU is an active actor and part of what is happening in this context. So just to also give you an illustration, so there, I might mention this in the paper, but so there is a directive called Directive 2060-EC. It's the Water Framework Directive, which obviously all EU countries are bound by. And this directive imposes very strict rules on any hydromorphological alteration of watercourses within the EU. So in this way, EU countries, this is why we haven't seen such a boom of small hydropower in the EU, for instance, or in EU countries, even though there are, you know, individual instances where, you know, these plants operate and generate and are productive, but they're not in this way, in this particular form. They're not, you know, experiencing a boom because of this, because of these legal protective measures, which are kind of offer a layer of protection that you don't have. So you have the EU's energy interests being extended in a very direct way, while the protective measures are not there. And this is, you know, obviously Serbia is in the process of opening various chapters, and I think this is chapter 27, where it's supposed to adopt this directive that I just mentioned as well. But, you know, this is a long process and this isn't a priority. So this, who knows when this will actually be adopted. Whereas on the other hand, you have kind of mandatory, you know, targets, national targets imposed. Most recently, a target was imposed. So the 2023 target, so this is the 2030 target, is 40% of all of Serbia's energy is supposed to be renewable by 2030, which is, I mean, I don't know, you know, it didn't meet the previous target of 27%. So what is the advantage of imposing these arbitrary targets, which, you know, are not are not going to be met? So so it's just this kind of, and also kind of, this is what Dorothy Bold talks about, and kind of this extension of neoliberalization through the accession process. And whereas, you know, the embedded neoliberalism remains within, or what is left of it at least, within the confines of the EU. Okay, so what I have, how much time? Okay. I just want to quickly respond to the other questions. Yeah, so the relation between the EPS, so the Serbian electrical, the state kind of electrical utility, and the individual investors. So the relationship is that, so even the Serbian electrical company actually owns several, I think 15 small hydropower plants itself. But it, you know, the relationship is that it is in charge of all of the energy production and management. So it purchases energy from these small hydropower plants. So that is the relationship. And scalar relations, yeah. So what I started writing this paper in a very optimistic kind of way. I'm not as optimistic as I was then now, because yeah, so one of the things that I also found is the fact that protesters were targeting banks and were managing to kind of make the link between the various actors involved, and not just target the state. There is at the same time a feeling now, at least in hindsight, that the state, and particularly Aleksandar Vučić, the president of Serbia, is is perceived as the only and main culprit for everything that is going wrong in the country. And that and that, moving past that perception and that understanding is very difficult at a higher scale. And there is this kind of feeling that protesters, even though they're aware of different actors, they feel that if he were not to be in power, that things would be much better. And this I think it makes me feel very pessimistic, because I think without kind of understanding all of these interconnections and understanding the role that all the pieces of the puzzle, and in particular the material basis of all of these processes, then how will we build a meaningful alternative, even if the president were not in power? So this is, and I'll stop here because I've been talking for a very long time. But yeah, okay, is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your responses. Thanks a lot for your two commentaries. And yeah, I guess with that we can launch into the Q&A. So yeah, everyone who has a question or a comment, raise your hand, either visually or with the Zoom functions, and then we can launch into it. And Yuliya, have something right away.
Yeah, thank you. I have I do not know if it's a very short, but it is to me, like compared to other ones. It's a short follow-up question, because I'm curious about this. So there is this, you've mentioned, which is very important, and I think it's something that is easy to overlook potentially, right? Because rules change. So a lot of these kind of projects, should the country being a member of the EU, they wouldn't be able to pull off, right? So they aspiring to become the member of the EU. So let's imagine that, like, okay, there is a timeline in the next 2 years. So what happens then? They have to rip it all apart. Because this is like, so you cannot, again, there is this kind of inconsistency, right? So on the one hand, we want to be members of the EU and we want to decarbonize, but then we are putting in place projects that, according to certain directives, we shouldn't be putting in place. So how does that work? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yuliya. We have a couple of hands up, but mine as well. So I think I'll follow up right away. Because I was kind of curious. It is a very central and very crucial argument in your paper to underline the sort of multi-scalar nature of authoritarian neoliberalism and kind of the complicity of the EU in this. So I'll try to maybe critically discuss that a little bit, because I was kind of wondering, how and to what extent specifically can we blame the EU for the authoritarian nature of this? Like, where exactly do we identify the EU's contribution to making this authoritarian, if that makes sense? Because I was wondering, what could it do differently? Is it the fact that there are accession criteria in general that just create this sort of coercive dynamic? Is it the fact that there are renewable energy targets? Do we not want renewable energy targets to a certain extent from a progressive perspective? Is it the fact that renewable energy investments have too much freedom, maybe, that they're not tied to conditions for democratic accountability, conducting sort of collaboration with local communities, making sure impact assessments are valid, etc. Maybe excluding small hydropower at all as an option. And wouldn't that also be kind of disciplinarian if that were implemented? So in that sense, I'm kind of wondering where you see the actual fault here, in the sense that the EU is authoritarian, and what could it do differently? Yeah, then I think David has his hand up.
Thanks. And yeah, thanks for the paper. It's great. And thanks. It just gives us a nice insight into a point of contestation that otherwise we wouldn't have known about. It's nice, the detail of it matched with the kind of broader theoretical framing is really nicely presented and helps us to see what's going on. It's just I guess what it made me think about was, so we're thinking about authoritarian neoliberalism upholding this process, and what we're really looking at is a contestation of that, then I was interested in, well, to what degree is the state being authoritarian? Because you talk a bit about how the sort of growing national environmentalist movement turned into a political movement as well. So does that create any space for the state to support the initiative, the environmental initiatives that are going on and the protest movement that's going on? Because you mentioned, I think, is it ecological uprising? Is that's a kind of political initiative that comes out of it? So I wonder what the degree to which that could have an influence. And then at the end, you say, as the 2022 elections show, it's basically the radical right that wins, because they're able to present a narrative that's much more kind of compelling. So does that mean that the radical right sort of turn their support for environmentalism into a radical right agenda, or does it mean that they basically trying to figure out a way to silence or pour scorn or somehow deter the environmentalist movement? So I was just thinking out the politics of it, like to what degree is there a partisan difference between left and right, and to what degree are they supportive, and to what degree can they make a difference to the degree to which it's authoritarian or not? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Gemma.
Yes, thanks a lot for the presentation, and also to the organizer. Very, very interesting topic. And I think you got a lot of very interesting questions, so I will be brief. I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned that it was interrupted and then resumed in 2023. So I wanted to ask what's happening now, and in a sense also the question would be, what was the impact of this local resistance in your case study, but also this more beyond the scope of the paper, but for your opinion in the country and even maybe in the region, because I know it's been also in neighboring countries, this has happened. So yeah, just wondering the state of the situation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think that was it with questions so far, so feel free to respond.
So many great questions. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, yeah, Yuliya, I share your confusion here. I have no idea what the what the end game is for the EU in terms of facilitating, or at least kind of turning a blind eye to something that, according to its own regulations, would probably not be constructed. It really puzzles me, not just in the context of the small hydropower plants, but in just kind of the Serbian political economy as a whole and what is happening there. And it really doesn't make strategic sense, except when you take into account, for instance, that which is a common argument, that the president in power is facilitating the independence of Kosovo, which is a long-standing, long-term process. So the EU's ultimate interest is to turn a blind eye to everything that is happening in the country until that is complete, and then to return to kind of all the problems that have been created in the meantime. I'm not sure if that really makes sense to me, but it is something to keep in mind, that this is once again multi-scalar. But yeah, it is a good question. So yeah, this is also, how can we blame the EU for the authoritarian nature of what is happening? And this is where I think Alke and Ian's work is really, really beneficial, because we're talking about authoritarianism not in a kind of regime-centric way, as even though it may and can and is interpreted in this way in the literature, by understanding authoritarianism as through the lens of practices and through the lens of as a process. as this process that crosscuts a wide variety of actors and scales, it becomes possible to take into account the EU's role. So I'm treating the EU here as an actor, but also kind of as a field, as a field that is sort of being navigated. But so what can be done differently? That's a good question. I think for starters, be to not turn a blind eye and to not to actively to pay attention to the massive protests that are, to acknowledge the massive protests. I mean, I'm saying this, and I know how unrealistic it is, and I'm not even sure if I mean, so look at what's happening within the EU. So this is how I understand the authoritarian role of the EU. So contestation, so the state, can the state support the environmental initiatives? That was your question, David. No, the state hasn't really been supporting the environmental initiatives at all. It has been turning a blind eye to the environmental initiatives. So the kind of the small hydropower, the fight against, or the contestation against small hydropower has been kind of intertwined also with other fights, with the struggle against lithium mining, particularly Rio Tinto, which is kind of trying to kind of establish its presence in Serbia at the moment. Also, we have extremely kind of intense air pollution, especially in the winter months, that is very, very kind of noticeable in large cities in particular. So all of these fights and struggles are interlinked with each other and kind of enmeshed in the public consciousness. This is, I think, how the radical right is also managing and kind of in taking advantage of this dissatisfaction and this feeling that environmentally, we're kind of being polluted, our air is polluted, our rivers are polluted, and this is the moment where the radical right, I think, is having an easier time of kind of taking advantage of this anger. I don't think that the radical right has the ability to do anything substantive or wants to do anything substantive, but in terms of narrating the crisis, I think they're doing a much better job of it. And then finally, right, the state of the situation at the moment. So this was interrupted. So this has been going on for over 4 years now, this particularly in Rakita. And the thing is that everything just moves very slowly. The court system moves very slowly in Serbia. So what we have now in the context of Rakita in particular is, as far as I know, the power plant is working, it's operating. They're waiting for a variety of court decisions to be made. So I think there's also a call being made, but this is the thing, and we're having elections every 2 years in the country. This is kind of a tactic by the government to keep everyone constantly in this feeling of instability and insecurity. And so there's always a campaign, and there's always mobilization in the context of the campaign. So at the moment, what we're seeing is a lot of the activists who were engaged in these fights. For instance, one of them is a member of parliament and was also campaigning. And so all of these, active struggles have to kind of take the back seat while this is happening. So I think there have been plans to mobilize again and to try to actually physically for this, this time for real, to remove the pipe from the riverbed with like a crane, and but this hasn't materialized. So I guess what is the state of the situation? It's kind of bleak, but it kind of, yeah, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, we have some more questions. So yeah, Yuliya.
Yeah, I think it's a quick one, maybe something to kind of to consider in the future. So I started thinking, like, who makes those the equipment for all of them, like, and my suspicion is that my hunch was correct. Quite a few of those countries are actually what's West European countries, and if there are restrictions on using that kind of equipment in EU proper, you need a new market, don't you? So there should be some sort of connection to this. Maybe I'm just a suspicious skeptic. So I just looked it up. So the biggest players on the international market are Voith, Germany, Andritz, Austria, GE, Renewable Energy, France. Well, there is Toshiba, there is Siemens. And then there is also India, UK, and like 2 Indian companies and 1 UK company. So it would be curious to see, but there hasn't been, kind of, there is all of this stuff that we produced, we can't shift because of all of these regulations. How about we bring this beautiful renewable technology and advise to this government to implement it? Because, we've got the production facilities, and we probably already made too many, no one's buying. That it could be some curious sort of investigation to do. I may be wrong, but these kind of things happen frequent enough to sort of hypothesize, right? So just like a curious one to kind of take a look at what kind of, so we know that there are, your opportunists for accumulation in the domestically itself, domestically, of course, because, well, that's how capitalism works. But somebody's making equipment and somebody's raking in the money. And yeah, it would be a curious one to sort of take a look at. Thanks.
Right. Thanks a lot for that, Yuliya. Yeah, Alke.
Thank you. So maybe just as a short comment also on the EU as an actor that employs authoritarian practices directly. I think it's just also, and Aleksandra, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's these really strong incentives that the EU poses to implement infrastructure projects, not just the regulatory framework, right? And despite contestation. And there seems to be no interest really for the local concerns or anything. There's not even, I mean, if I understand correctly, there's no regulation, no legislation either for them to appeal, to demand consultation or anything like that. So, and then the other thing, you mentioned the EIB in the paper, the European Investment Bank, and I think it's also quite interesting to look at the lending practices and the ways in which these infrastructure banks become, in a way, political actors elsewhere as well. And I'm reminded of the work of Alessandra Bonci, my colleague here in the project on infrastructure, her work on Tunisia, where there is a direct presence, for example, well, in this case, not of an EU institution, but of the GIZ in the Ministry for Energy in Tunisia. So they actively shape energy policies in the country. And I would guess that similar relations exist for other places, right? So there might be grounds to explore these kind of institutional arrangements as well for Serbia.
Thanks a lot, Alke. I have a bit of a follow-up myself, specifically on the topic of the far right. I think it's unfortunately pretty widely the case that the far right can sort of benefit from crisis situations. But what I find very curious in this particular case is that the movement, the sort of local movement that you described that developed there was very explicitly left wing and environmentalist, which I find curious because usually when you have these sorts of local, almost like NIMBY style resistance movements against any sort of renewable energy, those tend to be right wing, or there tends to be a lot of risk of right wing co-optation. And the fact that that hasn't really been the case here is very curious. And if there's sort of any source for optimism, I think that would be also part of it. Yeah, that was all. And yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I don't know, Alex, do you want to conclude with anything?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So Yuliya, absolutely. This would be so interesting to get into. I wish I had the time, but it's a really, really good point, good question. Who makes the equipment? Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely something there. There is quite a bit of investigative reporting covering, these various criminal dealings and the criminality of the small hydropower plants, who the investors are, which banks are financing the investments, but there's very little on this, surprisingly. So I think that would be also something to do research on. Yeah, Alke, I think you answered Ben's question better than I did. So I definitely think that this is a good way of summarizing the role of the EU and the EU's essentially facilitating role for kind of these authoritarian practices and processes. It will be very interesting to read your colleague's work. Sorry, you mentioned Aleksandra, but what is her surname?
Bonci with a B.
Bonci, okay, I've written down.
Yeah,
Okay,
but
that would be because yeah, sorry.
No. I mean, I think you know this much better than I do, but so not me phrasing this better. But yeah, I can put you in contact, the two of you. That'd be great.
That would be great, yeah, because I suspect there's something similar happening in Serbia as well. I mean, I definitely wouldn't be surprised. So, and then finally, the kind of the very explicitly left-wing nature of the protests or the contestation efforts. I mean, there is, yes, they definitely are and were very explicitly left-wing. At the same time, what is happening and what a lot of this kind of organizing is suffering from is this idea of, or this conviction that it is necessary to formalize and to professionalize in order to accomplish something. There's so much was accomplished through these direct actions, through these organization efforts. The case of Rakita isn't the best example because of the fact that it started operating again, but it's to be concluded. But at the same time, in Pirat, which is a town relatively close to Rakita, you had small hydropower plants be banned for 15 years. So so much was accomplished, but there is a sense of failure among the community, among people in general. There's a sense that you can only do something if you engage in politics, to engage in party politics. And if you become elected, an elected official, you will somehow be able to solve the country's problems much better than you are able to as someone who is resisting locally what is happening. To an extent, I mean, I do understand this, but there is a sort of defeatism among the left. So this kind of optimism that you see is, I don't know, this is maybe the other side of it, is which is kind of, I don't want to end here, but this is kind of, this is the state of the situation, but yeah.
Hey, yeah, thanks a lot, then. This was really exciting, really fascinating. Thanks a lot to you, Alex, obviously. Thanks a lot to Yuliya and Alke for your uh fantastic and insightful comments. Thanks a lot to everyone else for being here. And while I have you here, I think I would also like to plug our next event